I never thought a single signature could dictate the course of my marriage, let alone my life. But looking back, I should have known. When I met Claire, I was just a guy with ambition and a whole lot of drive, working long hours at a mid-tier consulting firm in Chicago. She was the kind of woman who turned heads effortlessly, charming, confident, and with a laugh that could light up a room. We met at a networking event, and while I had been there to make career connections, I walked away with something far more significant. Claire's family was well off, wealthy, actually, old money. Her father, Leonard, owned a chain of high-end hotels, and her mother, Margaret, ran an art gallery that catered to Chicago's elite. Their world was one of charity galas, summers in the Hamptons, and silent nods to exclusivity. I, on the other hand, came from a hard-working, middle-class background. My parents, a retired firefighter and a school teacher, gave me a strong work ethic, but not the kind of connections Claire had been born into. Despite our different upbringings, Claire and I clicked. It wasn't just physical attraction, though, God knows, she was stunning. It was the way she saw the world. She didn't act like the spoiled rich girl I'd expected. She was passionate about education reform, working as a project manager for a nonprofit. She wanted to make a difference, and for me, that was enough. Within a year, I knew she was the one. I proposed on a crisp autumn evening in Lincoln Park, under a canopy of golden leaves. She said yes before I even finished my speech, tears glistening in her eyes. It was supposed to be the beginning of our forever. But then came the prenup. Her father brought it up first, sitting me down in his expansive, mahogany-lined office like I was some intern he was about to mentor. "This is just a formality, Ethan," Leonard had said, sliding the thick document across the table. "Claire's financial future needs to be protected. I'm sure you understand." Understand? No, I didn't understand. It wasn't just about the money. I wasn't some gold digger looking to cash in. I had a career, my own goals, and I was doing fine on my own. But that document made me feel like an outsider, like they saw me as a risk rather than family. I wanted to push back, but Claire, sensing my hesitation, placed a hand on mine and whispered, "It's just paperwork, Ethan. It doesn't change how we feel about each other." So, I signed it, not because I wanted to, but because I loved her, because I believed we were bigger than a contract. The wedding was grand, too grand for my taste, but Claire was glowing, and that was all that mattered. My family, while overwhelmed by the sheer extravagance, celebrated with me. My younger brother, Jake, even joked, "Guess you're one of them now, huh?" But as I looked at the sea of pearl necklaces and designer suits around me, I wasn't so sure. The first few years of marriage were solid. We moved into a cozy apartment downtown, both working long hours but making time for late-night takeout and movie marathons. Claire was my rock, and I was hers. I ignored the passive-aggressive comments from her family about our modest lifestyle, their constant reminders of how Claire was used to certain standards. I let it slide, because Claire was on my side. Or so I thought. Then, things changed, starting with my career. I had always been ambitious, but I hadn't expected my business venture to take off the way it did. What started as a risky side project, helping struggling firms optimize their financial strategies, turned into something massive. Within 4 years, I went from a mid-level consultant to the CEO of my own firm. And with success came wealth. Real wealth. Claire was thrilled at first. She loved the new house, the vacations, the ability to donate more to the causes she cared about. But her parents? Oh, they took notice in a different way. I should have seen it coming. The quiet shift in their attitudes. The way Leonard, who had once barely tolerated me, now invited me to his golf club. How Margaret suddenly started talking about building a legacy together. Then, one night, over an expensive bottle of wine at their estate, Leonard brought it up. "You know, Ethan," he said, swirling his glass, "given how well you've done for yourself, I think it's time we discuss something that no longer makes sense." I already knew where this was going. The prenup. I glanced at Claire, expecting her to brush it off, to say it was a non-issue. But she didn't. Instead, she just took a long sip of wine, as if she had been preparing for this moment. Leonard leaned forward, his voice smooth. "It's outdated now, don't you think? You're not the same man you were when you married Claire. You've built something incredible. There's no reason to keep an agreement that doesn't reflect your current status. I set my glass down, forcing myself to keep my tone neutral. It hasn't been an issue for Claire and me. Why change it? Margaret sighed dramatically. Because marriage is about trust, dear. And keeping that document in place sends the wrong message. Claire still said nothing. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just Leonard's idea. Claire was in on it too. Something in my stomach twisted. I had spent years proving myself, proving to them that I wasn't some liability. And now, when I had built something of my own, they wanted me to adjust. The contract? I forced a tight smile. I'll think about it. It was a lie. Because in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about trust. It was about control. And I wasn't about to hand it over. I tried to shake off the unease from that night, but something about the way Leonard had framed it gnawed at me. The prenup had been about protecting Claire's financial future. So why was it suddenly a problem now that I had money? Claire and I drove home in near silence. She kept glancing at me, waiting for me to say something, but I wasn't about to start that conversation while I was still processing everything. It wasn't until we were back in our house, standing in the dimly lit kitchen, that she finally broke the silence. "Ethan," she said, setting her clutch down on the counter. "I know that probably caught you off guard." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Yeah, you could say that." She sighed. "Look, my dad just—" "Don't," I interrupted, shaking my head. "Don't make this about your dad, Claire. You didn't say a word when they brought it up. That wasn't them blindsiding me, that was you too." Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she exhaled through her nose and looked away. "You know it doesn't make sense anymore," she said finally. I narrowed my eyes. "What doesn't make sense? The agreement your parents insisted on? The one they pressured me into signing because they didn't trust me? And now that the tables have turned, I'm supposed to just— what? Pretend like none of that happened?" Claire's jaw tightened. "This isn't about them not trusting you. Then what is it about?" She hesitated just a second too long. That was all I needed. I pushed away from the counter and turned toward the living room. I needed space, needed to think. But Claire wasn't done. "You're acting like I'm trying to steal from you," she said, her voice rising. "This is supposed to be a partnership, Ethan. Why does keeping the prenup matter so much to you?" I turned back to her. "I don't know, Claire. Maybe because the only thing that's changed is my bank account." Her face twisted like I'd slapped her. "That's not fair, isn't it?" She crossed her arms, her frustration mounting. "You're making this into some kind of battle, but all I'm saying is that we don't need it anymore. I don't care about the money, Ethan. I care about what keeping it says about us." I let out a bitter laugh. "Right. But when your parents made me sign it, that wasn't a reflection of us. That was just smart business, right?" She didn't have an answer to that. The conversation didn't go anywhere that night, or the next, but the tension between us settled in like a permanent fixture. I caught her looking at me differently, less like a partner, more like an opponent. And then, just a few weeks later, I found out why. I had been at the office late, going over some last-minute details on a new deal. The cleaning staff had already made their rounds, and the place was quiet except for the occasional hum of the AC. I stood, stretching, and decided to check my phone before heading home. There was a text from my friend Chris. "Hey man, weird question, but is Claire out of town?" My brow furrowed. "No, she's home." "Why?" A few minutes passed before Chris responded. "Thought I saw her at the Langston with some guy. Might have been someone else, but looked a lot like her." The Langston, an upscale bar across town. The kind of place Claire and I never went to. Mostly because it was pretentious and full of people who cared more about their Instagram stories than their actual drinks. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. Maybe Chris was wrong. Maybe it was nothing. But something told me I needed to check for myself. I grabbed my keys and left the office. It took me 20 minutes to get across town, and the whole time, my mind ran through 1,000 possibilities. By the time I pulled up to the Langston, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I stepped inside, scanning the dimly lit bar. And then I saw her, Claire, sitting in a booth at the back, with another man. I felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs. She was laughing in that effortless way she used to when we first met. leaning in close, a hand on his arm. It wasn't just casual, and it sure as hell wasn't innocent. I didn't make a scene. I didn't storm over and demand answers. I just stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. Then I turned around and walked out, because suddenly, everything made sense. The push to get rid of the prenup, the sudden shift in how she looked at me, the tension in our house. Claire wasn't just having second thoughts about our marriage. She was already planning her exit, and she didn't want to leave empty-handed. I drove home in a haze, my grip on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The image of Claire, her laughter, the way she leaned into that guy, it played over and over in my mind like a cruel, taunting reel. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my chest was tight with rage and something worse, betrayal. I stepped inside our house, the same one I had worked my ass off to afford, and everything felt different, like I was standing in a place that no longer belonged to me. The lights were dimmed, a soft glow spilling from the living room where Claire sat curled up on the couch with a book, looking every bit like the devoted wife waiting for her husband to come home, like she hadn't just spent the night flirting with another man. I shut the door harder than necessary, and she looked up, startled. "Hey," she said, stretching. "You're home late." I stood there, staring at her, trying to reconcile this version of her with the one I had seen an hour ago. "Yeah," I said, my voice clipped. "Work ran long." She smiled, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "I left you some pasta in the fridge if you're hungry." I forced myself to nod, to move past her without letting on what I knew. I wasn't ready, not yet, because this wasn't just an affair. This was calculated. She wanted the prenup gone for a reason, and now, I had a damn good idea what that reason was. For the next few days, I played along. I kissed her goodbye in the mornings. I responded to her texts like nothing was wrong. I let her think I was just busy, stressed from work. But behind the scenes, I was gathering information. Chris had only seen her that one night, but I wasn't about to let that be the only proof I had. I reached out to a private investigator, someone I had worked with briefly when my firm had been vetting a sketchy business deal. The guy was efficient, discreet, and he didn't ask questions. "I need to know who she's seeing," I told him. "Where they go, how long it's been going on." He didn't even blink. "Give me a week." That week felt like the longest of my life. Every time I looked at Claire, I felt the urge to throw everything in her face, to demand an explanation, to make her admit what she was doing. But I waited. And when the PI called me 7 days later, his words were the final nail in the coffin. "Your wife's been meeting with the same guy for at least 2 months, he said. "His name's David Langston. Investment banker. Divorced. No kids. They've been careful. No public affection in obvious places, but they meet up at private clubs, hotels. I tailed them to a boutique hotel last Thursday." "A hotel?" I swallowed back the bile rising in my throat. "Send me everything you have." Within minutes, my phone pinged with photos, Claire and David, sitting across from each other in a secluded corner of a restaurant. Claire stepping into a sleek black car that wasn't hers. And the worst, Claire and David entering a hotel together. She had been lying to me for months, and now, I knew why she wanted the prenup gone. She wasn't just cheating. She was setting herself up to take half of everything I'd built. I walked into the house that evening calm, eerily so. I had thought I'd be shaking with anger, my voice tight with fury, but instead, I felt clear. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg for an explanation. I was going to burn her plan to the ground. Claire was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she poured a glass of wine. She looked up and smiled as I entered, like she hadn't a single care in the world. "How was your day?" she asked, taking a sip. I set my briefcase down on the counter. "Pretty productive," I said. "Had an interesting conversation, actually." She raised a brow. "Oh." I leaned against the counter, watching her closely. "Yeah. Spoke to a guy named David Langston." It was subtle, but I saw it. The way her fingers tensed around the stem of her wine glass, the flicker of panic in her eyes before she masked it with confusion. "I don't know who that is," she said, her voice just a little too careful. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's funny," I said, "because I have photos of you walking into a hotel with him last week." The glass nearly slipped from her hand. She caught it, setting it down carefully before looking at me, her face pale. Ethan, No, I held up a hand. Don't bother. I know everything. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak, because there was nothing she could say. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tossed it onto the counter in front of her. The screen was still open to the file the PI had sent me. Go ahead, I said. Take a look at your hard work. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone, scrolling through the images. I watched her, waiting for tears, for apologies, for some pathetic excuse. But what I got instead? Cold calculation. She set the phone down and straightened her shoulders, her expression shifting into something eerily composed. All right, she said. You found out. That was it. No tears. No denial. No panic. Just an acceptance that the game was up. I let out a slow breath. You were going to try to get rid of the prenup before you left me, weren't you? She didn't answer. That was answer enough. My chest tightened, but I refused to let her see how deep the betrayal cut. You're going to pack your things, I said, my voice low. You're going to leave this house tonight. She crossed her arms. And if I don't? I smiled again, this time with actual amusement. Oh, Claire, I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice just enough to make her lean in. You should have read that prenup a little more carefully. See, there's a clause about infidelity. And because I have concrete proof, you don't get a damn thing. That hit its mark. Her breath hitched, her nails digging into her arms as she processed what I had just said. You're lying, she whispered. I shrugged. Call a lawyer. I watched as the reality of her situation sank in. She had played her hand too soon. She had thought she could manipulate me, could control the narrative. But she had underestimated me. You have 1 hour, I said, turning away. After that, I'll have security escort you out. I walked to the living room, sat down, and turned on the TV as if my life hadn't just imploded. Behind me, Claire stood frozen. Then, without another word, she stormed up the stairs. I didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her as she spent the next 45 minutes gathering her things. When she finally walked past me, suitcase in hand, she paused at the door. This isn't over, she said, voice shaking with fury. I muted the TV and met her gaze. Yes, Claire, I said. It is. Then I turned the volume back up. And just like that, she was gone. The silence in the house was deafening after Claire left. I sat there for a long time, staring at the TV, not really watching. My whole body felt drained, like I had just run a marathon with no finish line. The weight of everything hit me all at once. Years of building a life together, all leading up to this moment where she walked out the door, suitcase in hand, not as a partner, but as a stranger. I wanted to feel relief. I wanted to breathe easier knowing that I had stopped her from taking advantage of me. But all I felt was empty. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Claire, laughing with another man. Claire, carefully calculating her next move. Claire, looking me in the eye as if I was the problem in all of this. By morning, my phone was already buzzing. Claire's parents. I let it ring. The next call was from an unknown number. Probably a lawyer. I let that ring, too. I wasn't about to jump into whatever legal mess Claire thought she could pull. She had no leverage. The prenup was ironclad, and I had the evidence of her infidelity to back it up. She could try to fight, but all she'd do was waste time and money. Instead of answering, I called my lawyer first. Morning, Ethan, he greeted, his voice calm as ever. Figured I'd be hearing from you soon. She's gone, I said, rubbing my temple. And she's about to make this as messy as possible. He hummed in thought. Let her. The prenup is solid. The infidelity clause is on our side. If she tries to push, it won't get her anywhere. I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. Her parents are going to be involved, though. No surprise there. He paused. They might try to pressure you, but legally, they have no footing. Stay calm, don't engage directly, and let me handle it. That was exactly what I planned to do. Except Claire's family didn't know how to take no for an answer. By noon, my assistant buzzed into my office. Ethan, she said, hesitating slightly, there's a Mr. and Mrs. Harrow here to see you. Claire's parents. Of course. I sighed. Tell them I'm unavailable. I did, she said. They're not leaving. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Give me 5 minutes. When I finally stepped into the lobby, Leonard and Margaret were standing stiffly near the reception desk. They were polished as always, Margaret in a pristine ivory coat, Leonard in his signature navy suit. But there was something different this time. Their usual air of superiority had been replaced with barely concealed urgency. Ethan, Leonard greeted with forced civility. We need to talk. I crossed my arms, making no move to invite them further in. Make it quick. Margaret exhaled sharply. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. We just want to resolve things without unnecessary conflict. I almost laughed. Now they wanted to avoid conflict? I tilted my head. Claire made her choices. She's out of my house, and as far as I'm concerned, we're done. Leonard's jaw tightened. You don't have to be so harsh. She's still your wife. For now, I said coolly. Not for much longer. Margaret's lips pressed together, her eyes full of quiet fury. Ethan, be reasonable. You have plenty of money. Keeping the prenup in place? Ah, I interrupted, raising a finger. There it is. Let's drop the charade, shall we? This isn't about Claire's feelings. It's about money. Neither of them denied it. Instead, Leonard took a step closer, lowering his voice. You might feel like you've won this round, but think long-term, Ethan. Divorce can get ugly, and the court of public opinion is often worse than the legal one. I stared at him. Are you threatening me? He smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that sent a clear message. We wouldn't want things to get difficult, he said smoothly. A messy divorce could damage your reputation. Business relationships are built on trust, after all. I clenched my jaw, my pulse spiking. This wasn't about Claire anymore. It was about control, and her parents weren't above trying to ruin me to get what they wanted. I took a slow, measured breath. I don't respond well to threats, Leonard. It's not a threat, Margaret added quickly, her voice honeyed. It's a suggestion. If you agree to a private settlement, we can all move on without unnecessary hostility. A private settlement. They wanted me to pay Claire off. I had to stop myself from laughing. Let me be very clear, I said, lowering my voice to match Leonard's. I'm not paying Claire a cent. The prenup is staying. And if you so much as whisper my name in a negative light to the wrong people, I will personally ensure that every single one of your dirty financial secrets ends up in the hands of the IRS. Leonard's expression faltered for the first time. Margaret went stiff. I took a step closer. You forget. I know exactly how much debt you're hiding, how many failed investments you've been covering up. So, if you want to play this game, fine, but I will win. For the first time in my entire relationship with Claire's family, I held the power. Leonard swallowed, his throat bobbing. We'll see what the courts say. I smirked. Yes, we will. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked away. Claire had underestimated me. So had her parents. But I wasn't the same man they had looked down on all those years ago. I wasn't just fighting back. I was burning their empire to the ground. I wasn't sure how quickly Claire's family would retaliate, but I knew it wouldn't take long. They had built their entire world on controlling narratives, on crafting illusions of success, power, and untouchability. But now, they were desperate. And desperate people made reckless moves. It started small. A few days after my confrontation with Leonard and Margaret, I noticed whispers within my industry. Little things, subtle comments during meetings, the way people looked at me just a second too long. Then came the real hit. One morning, my assistant rushed into my office, her face pale. Ethan, she said, breathless. You need to see this. She handed me her tablet, already pulled up to an article from a well-known business blog. Rising CEO faces allegations of fraudulent dealings amid divorce drama. My stomach dropped. I scanned the article. It was vague, no real evidence, just anonymous sources claiming that my company had engaged in unethical financial practices. A smear job, plain and simple. Claire's family was coming for me. I clenched my jaw, shoving the tablet back at my assistant. Get my lawyer on the phone. Now. By the time I sat down with him an hour later, my lawyer, Daniel, already had a plan. This is a weak attempt at defamation, he said, flipping through documents. No specifics, no solid accusations. They're just trying to shake you. I exhaled sharply. They won't stop. No, Daniel agreed. But that doesn't mean we let them win. 2 days later, I struck back. I didn't waste time issuing some weak, defensive statement. Instead, I made them the story. I had my own contacts in the media, journalists who actually cared about facts. With a few well-placed calls, the whispers of Leonard Harrow's financial troubles started to spread. It didn't take much. A leaked report on his failed investments. An anonymous tip about his company's overdue taxes. A deep dive into the crumbling foundation of the Harrow family's empire. The headlines shifted almost overnight. Harrow empire facing bankruptcy? Insiders reveal Leonard Harrow's desperate attempts to stay afloat. Leonard tried to contain it, but the damage was done. And Claire? She wasn't handling it well either. I knew she was going to crack when she showed up at my house unannounced. I had just gotten home when the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Claire stood there, her hair disheveled, her eyes tired and desperate. She pushed past me before I could say anything, storming into the house like she still had a right to be there. I sighed, shutting the door behind her. You could have called. She spun around, fury radiating off her in waves. What the hell are you doing? I raised an eyebrow. You're going to have to be more specific. Don't play dumb, Ethan. She stepped closer, her voice shaking. The stories about my father, the leaks, this is your doing. I didn't bother denying it. Your father came after me first. She let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so this is revenge? No, I said, my voice calm. This is consequences. She shook her head, pacing the room. God, you're so heartless. You think this is just some game, don't you? You have no idea what you've done. Now, I laughed. A low, humorless chuckle. Claire, your father tried to destroy my reputation. Your entire family has spent the last decade treating me like an outsider. And now, after everything you've done, you want to stand here and act like you're the victim? She flinched, but I wasn't done. You cheated on me, I said, stepping closer. You lied. You tried to get rid of the prenup so you could drain me dry. And when that failed, your family resorted to smearing me in the press. So forgive me if I don't give a damn about whatever happens to them now. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For the first time, I saw something real in her eyes. Not anger, not entitlement, fear. Because she knew. She had lost. Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, to defend herself, to twist things in her favor one last time. But then her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and paled. I smirked. Let me guess. Your father? She didn't answer. But I knew. Leonard was panicking. The walls were closing in. She clenched her jaw, shoving her phone back into her purse. You're going to regret this, Ethan. I tilted my head. Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you. She turned on her heel and stormed out. I didn't stop her. I didn't even watch her leave. Because for the first time in years, I was done. Completely, finally, done. And I had never felt lighter. The fallout hit Claire's family harder than even I expected. It started with Leonard. The moment the whispers of his failing finances turned into full-blown headlines, his business associates began distancing themselves. Investors pulled out. Banks suddenly had concerns about his accounts. His pristine empire, the one he had spent decades building, was rotting from the inside out, and now the whole world could see it. Margaret wasn't faring much better. Her high society art gallery, once frequented by the elite, saw a sharp decline in interest. Apparently, when the money dries up, so do the invitations to all the right circles. And Claire? Claire was unraveling. She didn't reach out to me again, but I heard about her through mutual connections. How she had moved back into her parents' estate. How her mother had started making quiet inquiries to sell off expensive paintings and jewelry to cover temporary expenses. How Leonard, now drowning in debt, had been forced to sell off several properties just to stay afloat. I should have felt satisfaction, and part of me did, but another part? It just felt empty. For years, I had fought to prove myself to them, to make them see me as more than just an outsider who had married into their world. And now? Now they had nothing, and I had everything. I spent the next few weeks focusing on work, moving forward. But just when I thought the storm had finally passed, I got an unexpected call. It was from Amy, Claire's younger sister. I hesitated before answering. Amy had always been the quiet one, the only member of the Harrow family who had ever seemed uncomfortable with their power plays. When I picked up, her voice was soft, hesitant. "Ethan?" I leaned back in my chair. "Didn't expect to hear from you." She let out a breath. "I know. I thought you should know something." I straightened. "What is it?" She hesitated, like she was debating whether to say it at all. "It's Claire," she finally admitted. "She's not handling any of this well." I scoffed. "Not my problem." "I know," Amy said quickly. "I know, and I don't blame you for feeling that way. But," she paused, "she's in bad shape, Ethan. Really bad." Something in her voice made me pause. "She's drinking a lot," Amy continued. "She's not eating. My parents, well, you know what they're like. They're too focused on their own problems to care. Another pause. "I just thought you should know." I ran a hand over my face, sighing. Claire wasn't my responsibility anymore. She had made her choices. Still, a part of me, the part that had once loved her, felt a small pang of something close to pity. Amy didn't wait for me to respond. "Anyway," she said, "I won't bother you again. Just take care of yourself, okay?" I exhaled. "You too, Amy." She hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. Claire was suffering, but I couldn't save her. I wouldn't save her. Because some mistakes? They come with consequences. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. And just like that, Claire was officially out of my life. She walked away with nothing, just as the prenup had dictated. No spousal support, no access to my business, no share of the wealth I had built. She had gambled everything, and lost. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. No more fighting. No more proving myself to people who would never accept me. No more being someone's safety net. I had come out of this war unscathed, and I was never looking back. Freedom was a strange thing. For years, I had carried the weight of Claire's family, their expectations, their judgment, their quiet but persistent belief that I wasn't enough, that I had been lucky to be in their world, rather than the other way around. But now I had nothing tying me to them, and I had everything I had worked for. The months after the divorce were a whirlwind. My company continued to grow. I traveled for business, for pleasure, something I had never done without considering how it would fit into someone else's expectations. I poured myself into expanding my portfolio, making investments that I wanted to make. And I realized something. Without Claire, without the suffocating grip of her family, I was better. I slept better. I worked with a clearer mind. I made decisions without second-guessing whether they would impress or disappoint anyone but myself. And I thrived. One day, months after everything had settled, I found myself back at one of my favorite restaurants, a small, understated steakhouse downtown. I had taken so many business meetings there over the years, but that night, I was alone. No obligations. No company but my own thoughts. And then, as I was finishing my drink, someone slid into the seat across from me. I glanced up. "Amy, Claire's sister." I raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect to see you again." She smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I was walking by and saw you. Figured I'd say hi." I nodded, studying her. She looked different. Lighter. Like she had finally shed the weight of her family's toxicity, too. She gestured to my glass. "Celebrating something?" I smirked. "Celebrating freedom." Her eyes flickered with amusement. "You deserve it." I tilted my head. "What about you?" She exhaled, glancing down at her hands. "I moved out of my parents' house a while back. Got a new job. Cut ties." She looked back up, something resolute in her gaze. "They didn't just try to control you, Ethan. They did it to all of us. Claire she let them win." I leaned back in my chair, nodding slowly. "And you didn't." A small, proud smile played on her lips. Not this time. We sat there for a while, just talking. Not about Claire. Not about the past. But about the future. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking backward. I was looking ahead. And it felt damn good.